but I just thought I'd take a few minutes and greet all of you, welcome you, and I'll do this again at 6:30. But just to say, it's lovely. I'm delighted that all of you are here physically. After 2 years of masks and all the protocols, it's nice to be able to actually see people, shake hands, and so on and so forth. So I'll say this again, but can I request all of you to put your phones on silent? With new phones and advancing age, if you don't know how to put your phone on silent, look right, look left. Somebody might help you. And the last time around, which is pre-COVID, we had to remind people that you also have to switch your alarms off. That even if a phone is in silent mode, the alarms can go off. So in case you have an alarm, please, I should do that myself. So there's place here. Please come right up. Please come. We'll start at 6:30 sharp, and we plan to finish by 2000. That's 8 p.m. sharp again. So if anybody has to leave earlier, and I understand the pressures of Delhi and traffic and other commitments, my only request is do the shuffle now. Sit on the extreme ends of your row so that you can exit unobtrusively. I hope you don't think I'm being rude. We'd request and urge all of you to be at 8 p.m. But in the event, I understand, please make your exit very unobtrusive or quietly. There's place in front. Why don't you come up? Please come. Here, there's place here. There's place there. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is 18:30, 6:30, so we'll cast off. And again, let me welcome all of you on behalf of the India Habitat Center and the Society for Policy Studies. This is a lecture series that we had begun almost 6 years ago, and we were able to maintain a certain tempo pre-COVID. So I think it's a bit like saying that our life now can be reviewed as pre-COVID, and I hope we can use the term post-COVID. I'm not quite sure if it's premature, but this is the first lecture that we have been able to convene after the experience that we've all gone through individually and collectively as far as the COVID pandemic is concerned. So it's been, as I said, very gratifying for both the Habitat and the SPS that we have got this kind of a response. There are many reasons for that, not least the profile of our speaker for this evening, Professor Madhavan, but I'll come to him in a moment. But I just wanted to again welcome all those who are coming here for the first time for this lecture series, and those who have been with us in the past. It's a case of renewing contact and saying that we are delighted that you're back. Today in particular, I want to acknowledge both the presence and the fact that we've had this kind of a participation. First of all, from this extended, I don't want to use the word fan club and embarrass Madhavan, but well-wishers and this very, I would say, large cluster of friends and students and those I think who hold Professor Palat in high esteem. And when we announced this lecture, the response that the Habitat got and our society got was very, very robust. And Madhavan, I want to thank you and also embarrass you and say that we've never had this kind of a response for lecture series that we've had in the past. And I'm saying this knowing fully well that we have in our midst other speakers who have been part of the series, Ravi and various other people here this evening, but more seriously, it's lovely to have this kind of an audience response. I particularly want to acknowledge the presence of our students, in this case from Delhi University. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but Kamala Nehru, right? Lovely. My affiliation is Gargi and LSR, but let it not be said that I did not recognize Kamala Nehru. And the reason is my wife is Gargi LSR, that's why I'm saying that. But seriously, if I missed any other colleges, universities, please let me know. But we have made this conscious attempt to reach out to Gen Next, wherever Gen Next is, both in Delhi and outside of Delhi. And I'm also very glad to inform all of you that this particular lecture is being streamed live. And we've had, again, a very robust response from outside of Delhi, particularly from young people who are more au fait with social media and who saw the announcement of this lecture on different platforms and tuned in. And I gather from our technical team that the number of people who have tuned in literally for this 6:30 lecture has been quite good. So those who are not here physically and who are here with us on cyber, greetings and thank you very much for joining us, and I hope we can do this again. As far as our lecture today is concerned, you know the subject and you know the speaker, most of you. Ukraine and the war there, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I'm deliberately using that term, that phrase, though there has been some reticence and hesitation on the part of the Indian government in terms of how exactly they wanted to describe this. Moscow itself has called this a special operation. This is war. It's been tragic. It's come into our drawing rooms. It was said in 1991, perhaps some of you were not born then, but in 1991 we had the first war in Iraq, the war for Kuwait. And that's almost 31 years ago. And it was said that CNN had brought that war into our drawing rooms, the Tomahawk missile and various other strands of that war. The war in Ukraine has been magnified many times over in terms of the information, the images, and every citizen, every victim now is a journalist beaming pictures. And one of the features of this war has been this information overload. And that in turn has been utilized, exploited in different ways, and we have many narratives about the Ukraine war. But I think there's one broad conclusion, it's a bit tentative, that as in the case of any war, there is a fog. And this is a fog of many layers, of many domains. I think what is reasonably clear is that this is going to be a defining moment as far as this decade is concerned, for sure. Perhaps for this half century. But this is the kind of assessment and I would say inferences that would be drawn as we go along. And there is more credible information available about how this war is unfolding. There is deep anxiety on one strand, and that is the nuclear dimension. You'll remember that fairly early on in this war, President Putin drew attention to Russia's capability as far as WMD, weapons of mass destruction, were concerned. And that, I think, is cause for concern, even though most experts aver that it would never happen. But there was a similar sentiment, if you remember, in end Jan, early Feb, that Russia would not invade, Russia would not wage war. But to the extent that the future remains opaque in terms of where and how, or what are the paths, lots of gaming has gone on among professional circles about this war. I think perhaps we can look at the past in a reasonably informed way, to the extent that the past does influence and shape what is happening now. And again, there are many variations of the formulation. We've had Professor Miyashima from the United States, who has given us his own assessment, and they have roped in all the big names as far as American academia and the elite of America, whether it's Henry Kissinger or George Kennan, and what they had said and warned at that time. And I do recall that we had received, when I say we, at the Institute of Defense Studies many years ago, we received Professor Primakov before he became Prime Minister Primakov. And these were issues that were discussed at that time. The Cold War had just ended. And I do recall that in that little interaction, he was here for a few days. He drew attention to Ukraine and issues of that sort at that time. But we can, I think, have a more informed understanding of the past. And that really is the aim of the exercise this evening, that we are very glad that Professor Madhavan Palat could join us, find the time at very short notice, if I may add, when we reached out to him. He's a historian of impeccable credentials. Those of you who know him, many in this audience, I think, know him very well. His scholarship in his own domain, Russian history, is, I think, right at the very top. He's internationally recognized. He taught at the Jawaharlal Nehru University for many years, 3 decades, if I'm not mistaken, from 1974 to 2004, Madhavan. And subsequently, of course, he was better known, amongst other hats that he wore, for being the editor of the works of Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru when he was at the Nehru Memorial. I had occasion to hear Professor Palat over the last few years, pre-COVID, I would say. He spoke to us at the Nehru Memorial and in other places, and at JNU. All I can say is that he's a riveting speaker. And if you look at him, you'll see what I would call as the image of a man who knows too much. And Russian history is more than 1,000 years old, if not older, in terms of genealogy. And he's taken on this task, saying that he'll say his piece in 40 minutes. So there you are. I shall not delay the proceedings. I want to thank all of you once again who have come, and those of you who have just joined, please put your phones on silent if you haven't already done so. I think courtesy demands that a speaker of the gravitas and eminence that Professor Madhavan Palat brings to this forum should not be disturbed by cell phones. On that note, sir, may I invite you?
Thank you very much, Uday, for inviting me and in fact giving me such a handsome recommendation that I'd be hard put to live up to it. But anyway, I'll do my best. But it's great to be able to meet physically once again after all these years of being in ether, as it were, and now to see face to face. And I'm glad the stampede is not what Habitat Center claimed it was, and that there are some empty seats available after all. Now, it is Uday who told me to finish it in 40 minutes, all 1,000 years of Ukrainian history. So it'll be a bit of a run for that reason. But first of all, may I request you to just get used to the divisions of Ukraine, which I think by now, because the newspapers have been talking about it so much, you must be very well aware of. But nonetheless, let me just point it out very briefly, because this is something we'll be referring to periodically. Do you see up there where Poland is, and just east of where Poland is written, that whole section? It doesn't seem to be working. It is actually working, yeah. Roughly from here to here is what you'd call the West, consisting of 2 ancient historical provinces called Galicia and Volhynia. Nowadays they write in Ukrainian or Polish it's called Volyn. In Russian it's Volinia. And in English I think it comes in both forms, depending which book you read, which published when. So it's up there. This is the important. And that town of Lvov, or Lviv, is the capital of Galicia. It is the most important center of Western Ukraine, the center of Ukrainian nationalism in all respects. And further up, Lutsk, and up that way. And by the way, that Western Ukrainian stretch goes into Poland further to Chełmno. It's not there. All right. Poland has grabbed a part of old Ukraine that way. And the east is, of course, that's much more familiar, I think. It's Luhansk and Donetsk, but it's more than that. It's a larger section which is called the Donbass, of which these two portions are now declared to be independent. So that west and east, and between them runs the river, the great Dnieper. Kiev is up there, and it's the capital. It's the home of all Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, the origin of everything. And south here is the Cossack steppe. See Zaporizhia? The Zaporozhian Sech is here. And after that comes New Russia and Ukraine and Crimea. The big division is between this and this. And in between they're not so decided. Now the problem with Ukraine is it's a heavily divided society. It is so divided that it turns out to be the battlefield between the two big powers. So actually what we are witnessing, which you call the Ukrainian War, is a war between America and Russia, essentially. Fought in different ways, America through financial instruments and sanctions and all the rest, and Russia by direct invasion to prevent the advance of NATO. Ukraine does not, unfortunately, have an independent role. It is the battlefield. And it doesn't have an independent role because it is so divided. Each side, each part of it is orienting itself to another, either to America or to Russia. America means here America, European Union, or to Russia. And they're not able to come together to decide on what is Ukrainian or how to be independent. And this is particularly interesting for us to know because these are choices we made back in the 1950s itself with non-alignment. Exactly the problem that is faced. Do you have to go to the west or to the east in the Soviet Union? Said no, it has to be non-alignment. We were able to carry it off. But very few countries are able to carry it off. Only India and China actually did. All the others have fallen victim. And we see when Ukraine became independent, it has fallen victim. It hasn't been able to make the choice. So it has become the battlefield between the two. And it reminds me very strongly of Afghanistan. For 200 years, it has been the battlefield of the great empires, the British and Russian empires fighting it out over where exactly the boundary should be drawn. And Afghanistan was laid waste periodically and otherwise not allowed to develop into into a modern state. Always because the regimes are being changed by the British for a long time. And then after the Second World War, America took the lead, and you know the story of Afghanistan now. It has never been able to set up as an independent state. And interestingly, just as Afghans are always glorified as heroic, indomitable, never submitting to a foreigner and so on, although the foreigners are crisscrossing the country and laying it waste all the time, it is now the same story with Ukraine. And Zelensky, in some senses, represents that. So heroically defending Ukraine, standing up to the Russian bully, but in some sense completely helpless. He's the victim of both sides. And the arguments on both sides are both strategic and cultural. And they both are immensely powerful. The cultural has a strategic significance of its own. And that is what I'd like to take you through. And my point is to demonstrate how little initiative Ukraine actually has, and how much it is a victim of its own internal divisions, and why it is so porous and open to the great powers on either side to interfere and decide for Ukraine which way it should go. Ukrainians are very passionate about all these matters. They do obviously play a role, but They're not the decisive factor in each case. So they pull in both directions. The divisions began as long ago as the 13th century, when the division between Europe, between Latin Christendom and Orthodox Christianity. That is the line of division. And surprisingly, that division continues down to this day. And I'll hope I'll be able to point out the various ways in that division reappears again and again down into the 21st century. It is not exactly the same as it was then, but the geography is the same. And we see it again and again. That is why I pointed out the western portion, which is oriented westward to Catholic Europe, and subsequently to the kingdoms of Poland and Hungary and the Habsburg Empire. And in the 20th century, again Poland, Czechoslovakia and so on, and in the east to Russia. And what happens in between is the interesting part. Who manages to create a state? Now, what are Putin's justifications for invading? I have no hesitation to say it is an invasion. Invading Ukraine. They're familiar to you, all the arguments, but let me run through them quickly. First of all, it is a creeping advance of NATO, which he presents as an existential threat to Russia. If NATO is on the borders, then Russia cannot continue to be independent or secure the way it is expected to be. He is responsible for. So NATO is such a threat, and it is now reaching the borders of Russia. If Ukraine also goes in, and as NATO threatened, Georgia also in 2008. And you know what happened then. And then Putin has gone on to set it in the context of the 20th century. The German invasion during the First World War between 1914 and 18, when large parts of the Russian Empire were incorporated into Germany or under German occupation, Ukraine, the Baltic, and so on, the same Ukraine. Then during the Civil War of 1918 to 21, when again Ukraine changed hands, or all parts of Ukraine changed hands, I think Kiev changed hands 11 times or so during the Civil War years. And you had Germans, Poles, Russians, Bolsheviks, and White Russians, that is the ones who had been overthrown by the Bolsheviks, all fighting there, along with mass insurrections by Ukrainian peasants, anarchists, and God knows who else, and then interventions by the Western allies during the Civil War. So Ukraine was a full-scale battlefield in a way that no other part of the Russian Empire was. And it had to come through all this. You can read all about it in the famous novel by, what's his name? Sorry. Do you recall the name of... Oh, sorry, never mind. It slips my mind just now. I was thinking of contemporary Ukraine. But Putin has gone on beyond that into pointing out all the Cold War hostility from the West, followed by the betrayal of 1990 when it was promised that that NATO shall not expand, and they did expand when the Warsaw Pact was dissolved. It just goes on. So the NATO has now expanded into the whole of the Baltic, into Poland, Romania, and Hungary, and now it is threatening to reach into the ex-Soviet republics. It has already gone into the Baltic republics, but is threatening to come right up against Russia itself. That was accompanied by the color revolutions. You know, the attempted regime changes in Ukraine, Georgia, and Kyrgyzstan. These are called the color revolutions, inspired by America. Whether it was, there's a powerful role that America has played there. Whether it is as strong a role as Putin says it is another matter, but Putin has made it into a case. And generally the Russian establishment makes it a case of CIA intervention in Russian politics. And of course, the Chechnya insurgency, which he says was powerfully supported by the West. And he says, I know because I was in charge of intelligence. So I received all the intelligence and I know what happened. So all these charges he has brought against them. But he doesn't stop there. He's brought the important charge of the Nazi revival in Ukraine. This has been immediately dismissed in the Western media and Western governments as a bit of Putin-esque paranoia and complete fiction. He's inventing it out of his top of his head. Well, the basis on which Putin has made this charge, and is demanding the denazification of Ukraine, is that there are bodies inside Ukraine which are xenophobically nationalist, racist, anti-Semitic, terrorist, who are the heirs of the collaborators of the Nazis, with the Nazis, and are virulently anti-Russian. There are such groups there. One such group is what is known as the Azov Brigade, which you might have read of in the press recently. It was set up immediately after the Crimean annexation, and its job was to hunt down traitors, and traitors means anybody who's anyway oriented towards Russia, and their techniques are very violent indeed. They are more like fascist stormtroopers indeed. That is why he calls it denazification. And they are racist in the conventional sense of early 20th century Europe. But it is interesting that they're racist, and ironic that they're racist, although the European racism, or Nazi racism, was directed against the Slavs. And Hitler had earmarked 32 million Slavs for genocide. But contradictions don't matter. They always occur. And these people look upon the Russians as a danger who have to be exterminated. Oh, well, not exterminated, I'm sorry. Not now, at any rate. But the attitude is of that kind, and certainly anti-Semitic. Now, these are the people that Putin is referring to. In addition, he is referring to the remnants of the Nazi collaboration of the Second World War. Now, this is a dark history, which we hear of rather less because it is overtaken by the more hideous history of the anti-Semitism and the slaughter of the Jews. But in Galicia, Volhynia, the same two western provinces that I've been talking about, which is so nationalistic, so extremely nationalistic, they managed to slaughter as many as about 100,000 Poles. We do not know the exact figures. We know when these mass slaughters occur and are conducted by these informal groups going around, we do not know exact figures, but estimates are around that much. It was done in 1943, in the middle of the war, in the hope of having a territory which is completely free of Poles, so that it will be only Ukrainian after the war. And the reason they wanted to do so is that that was a territory which was being ruled by Poland after the First World War. So this was a targeted cleansing. Ethnic cleansing would be the right word, although the Poles have said this should be called genocide in itself. So to Russia, this brings up a very dark memory indeed. And the man who was in charge of it, or who was a chief inspirer, the leader of all these groups, was a man called Stepan Bandera. He finally fell victim to, he was put into concentration camps by the Nazis because he went too far, and finally he was assassinated by the KGB after the Second World War. But he was a typical fascist of this kind. Nazi collaborator, did everything, all the things that I've just described. Now, Bandera brings up the worst memories on the Russian side. And as if to prove that there is a Nazi element in Ukraine, in 2010, Yushchenko, the newly elected president, the pro-Western president, awarded him the Medal of Hero of Ukraine. That is the highest award that you can possibly be. Something like a Bharat Ratna. Yeah. There was such outrage the world over, including in Israel, because he's an anti-Semite also, that however anti-Russian they might be, they could not stomach this. So worldwide condemnation followed, and finally the award was withdrawn. But the fact that the president could think of doing such a thing, and he who had come in and practically put there by the European conglomerates, I'll just come to that in a moment, shows how deep is the support for it, that he thought it was worth his while to do so. He'd get support in Galicia, Volhynia by doing such things. Now, this is the context of Putin's charge of Nazi revival. To this, he's added another grievance. He's saying that there's an American strategy now to destabilize Russia by creating a domestic constituency, which will be entirely in favor of Western intervention, of Western structures of power, and will seek to overthrow Putin, not Putin, or the current regime. As if to prove him right, Biden only the other day said there should be a regime change. Putin should be dethroned. But independent of that, Putin made the demand earlier. He is going back to an earlier problem that occurred in the late Soviet Union. This is not merely a problem of the fifth column. That occurs always during war. It is not a matter of people seeking out friends in the enemy territory. America consistently and successfully created a domestic constituency in the Soviet Union which was very pro-Western. This is called the dissident intelligentsia. They are violently hostile to the Soviet regime, very pro-Western, and they created the right atmosphere domestically because of their great intellectual and other capacities, that when Gorbachev split the Communist Party, the reforming wing of the Communist Party joined hands with these people, and they together brought down the Soviet Union, finally installed Yeltsin in place, and he brought down the economy itself through liberalization and all the horrors that followed throughout the 1990s when half of Russia was sold off to the oligarchs and so on. That is a story, and all of them ended up in London that we read of nowadays. Now, all these things occurred with the active participation of this domestic constituency, which is so Western-oriented, who Putin says is living psychologically in Miami or on the Riviera, being provocative there, but that's a point. Now, what are Biden's justifications for this, for the counterattack? And he has counterattacked. It's full-scale war, but war through financial instruments and economic instruments. It hasn't yet come to physical war. It has been claimed by all Western sources, and of course by Biden, that this is an attack upon the West and Western values. It's an ancient claim, of course. Throughout the Cold War this was going on, and even in the 19th century. Russia was something that is always anti-Western and violating Western values in one way or the other. Now, the definition of the West as used in Europe, and the definition of Europe, as used there, always is, as I said, the territory of Latin Christendom. It is separated from Orthodox Christianity in the East and Islam in the West, and bounded by the Atlantic Ocean in the Islam in the South, and bounded by the Atlantic Ocean in the West. That is what constitutes Europe. Of course, now the West means much more, where Europe has expanded into North America and South America and so on. But this Europe is what is being attacked by Putin's advance, is the claim. And the irony of it is that in the West, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus are never included in Europe. Ukraine and Russia and Belarus are firmly part of the East of Russia, the barbaric East, or the Huns, or whatever you call them, at various times. And now Ukraine has been admitted into the select club by this definition. It is part of great power play, of course, but the Ukraine has made into the bearer of the West, of Europe, and European values, rather summarily. And the values that are being violated by Russia, by this kind of an invasion, are, well, we know them, what they always claim to be the values. They're democracy, rationality, the rule of law, human rights, an egalitarian society, human egalitarian society, prosperity, and social welfare, and similar good things of life. These are what's called Western values, the Western way of life, which Ukraine is meant to have embodied. I don't know on what basis they said so. Ukraine is a cesspool of corruption in every other respect. But anyway, that's how they claim it to be so. This is what is under threat. Now, in Russia, Russian liberals accept these classifications. Russia is internally divided. Liberals see themselves as European, and these are values that they espouse, and this is what they see as European. The rest of Russia, which is a majority, I would say, don't see quite these values. They see the other side of Europe, which would be genocide, anti-Semitism, imperialism, global warfare, and the rest. So there's a hideous side of Europe, which is seen by a whole lot of others, which when they talk in Europe today about European values, they completely exclude, although it was not very long ago that these values were propagated in Europe in great intensity. And in addition to that, of course, in Russia, the Orthodox Church detests the Roman Catholic Church. That is the ancient challenger. It is now more than 1,200 years old, years old, sorry. Goes back into the 11th century. So you have a very ancient division, and all through this millennium, the danger has been from this area. And the boundary keeps shifting here and there according to convenience. And we've seen the most recent shift. These are the arguments used. So in what way is then how does this line of division occur, and how do they shift? And why is it so permanent is the interesting point. And why is Ukraine still divided, as it was divided back in the 13th century, in the same way, such that Ukraine cannot set up an independent state, effective independent state, which is why it is such a victim. And I'd like to take you through that. It is a very ancient history and a very powerful history. And of course, it's interesting to know why, in spite of all that, they cannot get together. It should be possible. Divided peoples have got together and created nations. Why is that Ukraine is not able to? Now, the conversion to Christianity took place in the 10th century by a heroic and legendary king of Kiev called Vladimir, also known as Saint Vladimir. His statue is there up on the bridge at Kiev. You might have seen it in the newspapers the other day. They've covered it up, lest it be bombed. So the great Prince Vladimir converted and told his entire population to convert simultaneously. That's the advantage of being a great prince. You can tell everybody to convert. And they all did obediently. So Kiev became Christian back in the 10th century. Shortly thereafter, the great schism occurred in the Christian world. Orthodoxy split off from Roman Catholicism. And the Patriarch of Constantinople became the leader of Orthodoxy, just as the Bishop of Rome, known as the Pope, was the leader of the Roman Catholic world. That occurred in 1054. And that schism has never been closed again. It has remained ever since. And the hostility is bitter, indeed, between the two. And the line runs right through East Europe. Poland is on one side, it's Catholic. Poland, Lithuania is Catholic, along with the Baltic states, which are Protestant but used to be Catholic. So they belong to that side. That's why everyone says they are actually European historically. This is the meaning of it. But Ukraine was on the other side, but with a problem. Again, the same western provinces, Galicia and Vladimir. And I'll just come to that in a moment. It was in the 13th century, shortly after the schism, that the whole of the land of Rus, this is called the land of Rus, those who converted to Orthodoxy. From Rus comes the word Russia. And historically, we refer to the land of Rus. The whole of Rus was invaded from two sides. By the Mongols in the east in 1237, by Genghis Khan's grandson, Batu Khan, and from the west by the Roman Catholic Church's crusades, by German knights, the Teutonic knights. The two prongs entered the Slavic country, and everyone had to choose which side do you go to. Well, in the Russian national legend, the great choice was made by Alexander Nevsky of Novgorod, a 19-year-old boy. He beat the Germans and the Swedes in a famous battle in 1240. And again in 1242, the Battle of the Ice, which you must have all seen, Alexander Nevsky, the film by Eisenstein. Now, Alexander Nevsky was a brilliant general and a superb politician, and he decided it is safer to go with the Mongols than with the Roman Catholic Church. So he submitted to the Mongols, subordinated himself to them, and gained security from them. They kept off the Roman Catholic Church and the Teutonic Knights. That is, the Mongols held off Europe, in short. And Alexander Nevsky made this choice. At the same time, another choice was made in Galicia and Volhynia. Prince Daniel of Galicia, in that place called Lvov, which he founded, or Lviv, he tried to to escape the Mongols, turned to the Roman Catholic Church and to the empire, and conducted his marital diplomacy with Poland and Austria and so on. He didn't quite succeed. He still had to submit to the Mongols, who were far more powerful, but that tradition remained. He preferred this orientation to the other, and his successors all have preferred that. By one historical choice or another, they have turned westward. To Poland, to the Habsburg Empire, to Czechoslovakia, as the case may be, to Hungary, and so on. And that division has persisted. It's amazing that from the 13th century down to the 21st century, we have that same line of division. Galicia, Volhynia on one side, rest of Ukraine partially on one side, the eastern part fully on the other side. So, in this change that occurred, there are certain other regions called Transcarpathia. If you look down, do you see that place called Ushgorod? There. That is, see the Carpathians, Eastern that area is the Transcarpathia. And down there is this Chernovici, is the what's called the Bukovina. These two territories also went into various Western kingdoms and empires at different times. Transcarpathia went into Hungary very early, and it has practically always been with there. But they are Ukrainian, or another version of the Ukrainians. They call themselves Rusins and so on. And this area is even called Ruthenia. All these other Central European names are applied to Ukraine. So all these areas were very Western oriented, but the others were oriented to the east, to the Orthodox Church. And when Moscow came up, to Moscow, the successors of Alexander Nevsky shifted to base themselves in Moscow, and Moscow took precedence over Kiev as a center of power in the whole of the Slavic world, or in the world of Rus. To create one more division, in 1596, the Orthodox clergy of Western Ukraine split, submitted to the Pope, but kept the Orthodox liturgy. It was a compromise in the conditions of the counter-reformation that was sweeping across Europe at that time. So they combined the Catholic and the Orthodox churches in this way, under the Pope, but Orthodox in their liturgy and ritual. To the West, it seemed a good compromise. To them also seemed a good compromise, because the Roman Catholic Church was getting very powerful and sweeping across. Oh, I'm running short. But to the East, they looked upon as traitors, having left the faith. So multiple divisions have occurred already. You've got the split between two churches. You've got the split within the Orthodox Church, and this new church is called the Uniant Church. They're also called Greek Catholics sometimes, but the name of the church is the Uniat. It's no longer called the Orthodox. So you've got the Uniats here, Western oriented, and very much under the influence of Poland. At the same time, you've got the Eastern Orthodox one. It is in this situation that Poland develops into a major empire from the 14th to the 17th centuries. You have a Polish-Lithuanian empire stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, virtually, or to the littoral of the Black Sea. And Poland is able to attract and dominate half of Ukraine. So it becomes a tussle between Poland and Russia now, Poland represents the West, and this the East. It is in the course of all this that the first properly Ukrainian state emerges, what is known as the Hetmanate, under the Cossacks. The Cossacks are a freebooting soldiery living on the borders between the Ottoman Empire and Poland, Lithuania, and Muscovy. The Ottoman Empire, I must remind you, was all along here, the northern littoral of the Black Sea, along the steppe regions. The Crimea and so on were all Ottoman Empire. So the Cossacks were self-governing communities, very warlike, who provided the frontier security to Poland, Lithuania, and to Muscovy, against the Ottomans. They were fiercely orthodox, however, and therefore they conflicted with the Polish Commonwealth. And they were forced eastward as Poland advanced and colonized more and more into Ukraine. So they came under Muscovy, or Moscow. And in 1654, unable to contest three sides like this, they finally decided to submit to Moscow. And hence that state which they created is called the Hetmanate, the hetman of the Cossack state. That is the one time that Ukraine actually had a somewhat independent state. It was still subordinate to Moscow, but it was a coherent state with Kiev at the center, and it was on both sides of the river Dnieper. And that is the time when Kiev flourished in the 17th and 18th centuries. Roughly 1 century of great creativity in Kiev. It was a major academic and theological center. It provided all the resources, intellectual resources for Russia, more than Russia itself could generate. And it drew into itself the dynamism of the Counter-Reformation streaming from Europe through Poland and the Roman Catholic Church and the Jesuits. So they were able to combine it, and Kiev developed into a very flourishing center and provided one of the most important ideologues and propagandists for Peter the Great in the early 18th century. So this phase is when Ukraine had something like a state. And it is the basis of the proto-nationalism of the Ukrainians that this hetmanate was a Ukrainian national state. They claim in Ukrainian historiography that it was the equal of Moscow. Moscow, of course, says it was subordinate, that they had submitted in 1654 and paid homage to the Tsar. But in the 18th century, Moscow steadily absorbed the hetmanate and finally reduced it to a series of provinces. The state itself vanished. It became part of the Russian state. It became a series of provinces. The hetmanate itself was abolished in the late 18th century. And Poland itself vanished. As you know, Poland was divided between Russia, Prussia, and the Habsburg Empire in the course of the 18th century. So Poland vanished. The Prussian, Habsburg, and Russian kingdoms moved towards each other, and Ukraine was once again divided. In that division, Volhynia, Galicia went into Poland, Transcarpathia into, Volhynia went to Poland, Galicia into the Habsburg Empire. And this was the basis of a new nationalism in the West. When Galicia, the western part of Ukraine, went into the Habsburg Empire, the Habsburgs cultivated a Ukrainian culture domestically in Galicia to counter Polish influences. Poland was a troublesome neighbor and subject of the Habsburgs. So Galicia flourished. In Galicia, a Ukrainian national culture flourished, properly speaking. And it was the beginning of nationalism in Europe. So Ukrainian nationalism began to flourish there. That's how Galicia became such an important place for Ukrainian nationalism. And throughout the 19th century, up to 1918, Galicia was the center of Ukrainian nationalism, sponsored and supported in every way by the Habsburgs, because not that they were nationalist at all or liberal, but they wanted to outdo or put down the Poles. Therefore, this was useful. Poland to them was more dangerous than anybody else. And Russia finally faced this Galician Ukrainian nationalism when the time came, but it was all from here. This was the source of it. Now, in the 20th century, when the revolution occurred, when the empires all collapsed, the Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, it was a time for everybody to create their own states. Finland, the 3 Baltic states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, all of them managed. In the Caucasus, Georgia, of course, that was part of the Soviet one. I should not mention it, but it was very nationalist. It could be almost considered independent. All of them did. The one which did not succeed was Ukraine. It was a large territory. We see how it is. It has a significant history of nationalism in Galicia, at least, and partially in Volhynia. It is the source of Russian nationalism because of Kiev is where it all started, and yet it was not able to create its own state. Whereas all the much less well endowed, you might say, regions like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, all of them managed to create their own. And Poland was resurrected after having vanished from the map for a century and a half. And the reason is this particular fragmentation. They were never able to decide which way they have to be oriented. And they kept on raising the question amongst themselves, what is our destiny? Is it in the West or in the East? Instead of being able to claim that it is with themselves. And because of the pulls in each side, in each direction, it is more an internal division rather than the Russians and the Poles pulling them. It is an internal division. They could never settle. When the Galicians were extravagantly Western-oriented, naturally the Eastern Ukrainians, who were much more Russian-oriented, said, no, we cannot accept this. And we will rather look for support elsewhere, namely in Russia. And this went on. And in the post-war settlement, Galicia once again went into Poland, Volhynia also there, Transcarpathia to Czechoslovakia, and Bukovina to Romania. The Poles went in for a rapid Polonization as much as possible, and in the 1930s it became fascistic in that they repressed the language, the church, they tried conversions, and they went for colonization, Polish colonization in Volhynia. So it created an enormous anti-Polish nationalism in Galicia and Volhynia. It did not make those people more Russian, pro-Russian, but they were violently Ukrainian nationalists as a result of this. And in Bukovina and so on, you had similar Romanianization also taking place. So excellent ground for the resurrection of Ukrainian nationalism now in the 20th century, when nationalisms had gone so violent before the Second World War. And this is a crucible of every possible nationalism you could think of. But it didn't help them come together at all, because in the East was a completely different set of people. The Russians had colonized East Ukraine with the industrialization of the 19th century, when the great mines and metal plants were opened up. And it was not only a Russian population, but also a Russian-speaking population. The Ukrainians had become Russian-speaking, and urbanization had led to a completely different combination. So you have this kind of a segregation here. An urbanized, industrialized Eastern Ukraine, an extremely nationalistic Western Ukraine, and when finally the Soviet Ukraine was created in the 1920s, the nationalistic Western Ukraine was in Poland, outside of Ukraine. The rest of it was in the Soviet Union. So after the Hetmanate, this is the first time you had a Ukrainian state being created in the 1920s. So it should have generated an internal unification, we might have assumed, under normal circumstances. But what happened was this. The Russians went ahead with Ukrainianization. Namely, they promoted the language, promoted Ukrainians to jobs, created a Ukrainian political structure, Ukrainian Communist Party, everything Ukrainian, universities, etc. All the requirements were there, all the cultural and political institutions, which are completely Ukrainian. And Ukrainians were fully in charge of Ukraine for a change, except that the bosses were in Moscow. But the state and the nation was created by external circumstances. It was created by the policies of Moscow, of Leninist policies, rather than what is happening in Ukraine itself. I invite you to think for a moment about our own political history. The long period of anti-colonial mobilizations that took place, where every issue was thrashed out and leaders appeared in every ideological position, and there's no doubt about it as to how it was to come together and who and a series of charismatic leaders came up. That was not the case here. There was no state in waiting. It was Moscow which created the state here as part of the Soviet nationality's creation. So Ukraine got a state, but by an impulse from outside. And otherwise they were divided as ever. And that division showed up when the next opportunity came, which was in 1991. Then the whole of Ukraine became independent. Volhynia, Galicia, Transcarpathia, Bukovina, the central Ukraine and eastern Ukraine all came together as an independent state. They're already within the Soviet Union after 1945, but now as an independent state. But their independence came once again. It dropped into their lap. It came from outside impulses. It was not a Ukrainian national movement which created Ukraine. It was a split within the Russian Communist Party, or the Soviet Communist Party, which demanded the breakup of the Soviet Union as part of the politics of the attack upon the party, and therefore the independence of all the Union republics. Hence, Ukraine became independent. There was no national movement till then. Of course, there were national stirrings here and there of various kinds. But again, look at our own history and you'll understand what I'm talking about. There was nothing of that kind. Not even for 10 years was there in those 5 years that Gorbachev gave them, they set about it. And that was it. So Ukraine got the state, the nation. It was somewhat hollow. And it came by impulses from outside. And internally, they were so terribly divided. So after the Soviet Union collapsed, what happened? How did they try to create an independent state and nation? It was still possible, but it never happened. They divided so deeply, they could never do so. And if you study the nature of the advances of NATO and of the European Union towards Ukraine from the 1990s, each time you will see how the arguments always were, should we join NATO, should we join the European Union, or should we hold them off because they are a threat to our culture, our way of life, our future politics, our fate is with Russia, and so on. It went this way constantly. And the NATO, throughout the 90s and into the 21st century, offered a lot of cooperation without membership. They would keep on setting up any number of projects for cooperation, but never actually a membership. So Ukraine tried its best to satisfy NATO by participating in various NATO exercises in Yugoslavia or even in Afghanistan and Iraq. Iraq wasn't NATO, or partially. But it never got any benefit out of it. So it went on like this. And in 2008, NATO actually made the announcement that Georgia and Ukraine shall be offered membership, which led instantly to the Georgian crisis. The president of Georgia, Saakashvili, rashly assumed that now he had NATO support for invading Ossetia, that is now under Russia. And the Russians drove him back. That was a brief war in 2008, if you remember. And after that, the European Union and NATO held back because they were not confident that they could deal with what Russia was going to do or deal with Russian reactions in this case. But it always was a case of testing Russian reactions, how far they could go. And when they found the reaction was too strong, they would withdraw. And the ones who were suggesting perpetually that they can go into, that NATO can go forward, was America and Poland. These are the two proponents constantly. Poland is, as you know, virulently anti-Russian over a long history. And the ones who are holding back were Germany and France, the two pillars of the European Union. They said, this is not for us. We cannot afford these adventures. And while European policy was, in this sense, uncertain, Ukraine in itself was internally so divided, it could never settle which way it would do it. And these were revealed again and again in the series of crises we know as the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan crisis. The Orange Revolution in 2004-05 and the Euromaidan in 2013-14. Briefly, what they amounted to, what the important part of it, in the crisis of the Orange Revolution, they were trying to decide who was to be the president. Was it to be Yushchenko or Yanukovych? Both of them carry the name Victor, by the way. Yushchenko was completely pro-Western. Yanukovych was completely pro-Russian. This is how they presented themselves. Both were highly discredited politicians in every way. The levels of corruption and sleaze is extraordinary. We are accustomed to a lot, but I can tell you our institutions are monuments of integrity and stability compared to what Ukraine had in every way. So, and the worst is when the crisis of corruption occurs in Ukraine repeatedly, it leads to a collapse of government. This is the problem in Ukraine. We have corruption endlessly, scandals endlessly, but it doesn't actually destabilize the state. In Ukraine, what is happening, each time there was a corruption scandal, the state itself was destabilized and disintegrating in some way or the other. And in the crisis of the Orange Revolution was one such. They could not decide who was to be. Of course, the election commission there was one of the most corrupt bodies you could think of. So was the Supreme Court. So was the bureaucracy. So were the police. Everybody you can imagine had their finger in the pie or their snout in the trough. So finally, how was it settled? Who decided the result? It was an international mediation. Foreign ministers of Poland, Germany, France, and leaders from Russia came and settled the issue. Now, if you have an internal dispute between political parties, between a government and opposition, and you need foreigners to settle it, you can imagine how weak the state is. It's an index of it. And this happened again in the Euromaidan crisis in 2014-15. Exactly the same story. It led to bloodshed when the then President Yanukovych refused to sign the signed an agreement with Europe, with the European Union, and the Western Ukrainians went wild and said, how dare you stop it? We have to have it. And they brought their masses into Kiev, to the Maidan. It's called the Maidan, by the way, the big square there, some sort of Ramlila Maidan there. And they conducted their agitations there, and the police went berserk and shot 80 persons down, and so on. But in the course of that, you had people like John McCain coming and addressing the crowds there. And finally, it was settled by an intervention by European politicians coming and mediating and deciding who the new president should be. Now, I don't know what we would think if we had American senators coming and speaking in our election rallies in Delhi, of all places. And then you had mediators coming from China, Russia, Europe, and America to decide who the prime minister should be. But this is exactly what happened in Ukraine. It's an index of the weakness of the Ukrainian state and the chaos of Ukrainian politics and the corruption of civic, bureaucratic and political life there in every way. And Ukraine became such a victim there in all these respects. So this is the context in which, this is what enables NATO to make the advance into Ukraine. There's nobody in Ukraine, there's no consensus of policy in Ukraine about what they should do. They just pulled in two directions permanently. So NATO can make all these advances, Russia can make a counter advance, and finally Ukraine is up for auction. Sometimes literally. Who will offer more grants? Is it Putin or the European Union? It has happened in the case of Yanukovych. It goes that way. And the matter is never settled. And that is what it has led to even now. Now, with these, in these circumstances, when it cannot be settled, the tussle is then between, that is why it is between Russia and America finally. Ukraine is not a real player. Ukraine is only the foot soldiers in this battle or in this conflict. They are the sacrificial lambs, you might say, to both sides. They cannot decide. It will have to be decided between America and Russia. And they are the two who are not negotiating. The ones who are negotiating are Ukrainians and Russians. And Ukrainians are being told what to negotiate and not to surrender any position. And Zelensky is constantly playing the role of Churchill, or trying to. But that's not the real position he is in. He is completely helpless. But we do not see a solution. So if you ask me what is pushing it so far, why should NATO be advancing, and why is America pushing so far? The ultimate reason is this, I would suggest, that the agenda of the Cold War is incomplete. Russia is still not down. Soviet Union is down. It has broken up, but Russia still remains as a potential future power. I don't think it is likely to develop into that, but it has to be brought down. And I think American strategy is, in the long run, to see Russia in the position of Germany and Japan after the Second World War. It has to reach that position for American security finally to dominate the world. After that, it'll turn on China. But till then, it's Russia that takes precedence over anybody else. And that position has not yet been reached. And these advances are all ways of testing Russia. And you do remember Brzezinski's suggestion that Russia should split into 3 different states. European Russia, West Siberia, and East Siberia. And he said, Russia is just too backward to exploit Siberia, therefore we will, we meaning America. It's just like Canada, you see. So if you can develop Canada, why can't you develop Siberia? But obviously the Russians have not been able to develop it, and so on. So, I mean, these might be fanciful, but certainly these ideas circulate a lot, and they see the possibilities of it. If they can bring down the Soviet Union, why not bring down Russia? It is eminently possible as they see it. And this is part of that game. And Ukraine is just in the way, is just, as it were, on the way to Moscow. Next would be Belarus, it could be Georgia, it could be Armenia, each one of these, one by one. But what we are witnessing is just such a movement. And I would suggest that's the reason it is happening. I do not want to pass judgments on either side about how much the Ukrainians are suffering, or the Russians are nasty people, or whatever, or Putin is crazy. That I don't think those are very useful suggestions. It is the contest between great powers in this fashion which we are witnessing. And wars always are horrible. But it's interesting that we are witnessing. And wars always are horrible. But it's interesting that the entire media in the West has presented this as a humanitarian problem only, as if there's nothing else to it. All wars are humanitarian problems, but this has taken precedence over anything else, almost, to an extent that we seldom realize when we talk about wars. There's little discussion about strategy, only about the humanitarian crisis. It is to build up the complete unity of the Western world against Russia, and that it has succeeded very well. Such unanimity of opinion, such solidarity has seldom been seen at this level. And Russia is taking the hit. Russia will be a victim, obviously. It will not come out of it well. It will be terribly impoverished as a consequence of this. And we see some traces of back to Soviet times for Russia. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I took so long.
Fantastic. And absolutely, I think, amazing scope of the lecture that Professor Palat has delivered this evening. And I was just making notes saying that the last few minutes, I mean, there's a macro geography, macro politics, macro strategic culture where he spoke about what could be the objectives and the end game, a Russia that may be divided perhaps. But an interesting aside about connectivity and technology, Madhavan, when you were talking about corruption in Ukraine and comparing it with what is happening in this part of the world, my technical team has sent a message saying that there is a spike in the interest from outside and that we may get some responses on social media. But that's okay. I think it's part of democracy and the kind of reach we have. But from the time that Professor Palat started his lecture, and I think the hall has in a way become fuller, I want to recognize those who have joined us both physically and on cyber through these links. The cyber first, I'm told that it's an interesting message. The wise men of GK2 have joined and they wanted to be acknowledged. So I'm acknowledging you, through this medium. I'm sure it will reach out to you. And those who have joined on cyber and through the links, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box and our team will make sure that they come up here. That's the first announcement. GK2, you're recognized. I want to also recognize General Suresh who's joined us, Dr. Yadav who's come here, and I'm told that I can only refer to him as Citizen Gopal Gandhi, so I shall sort of stay that way and say that we are delighted that all of you are here. And now what I will do is that there's so much ready that Professor Palat has shared with us. I will request you to please ask your questions or make your observations again briefly. As is the normal protocol, please kindly identify yourself and you can ask your question, and if possible I'll take 2 or 3 at a time and then I'll come to the participants who are on cyber. So I shall take you all one by one from each side. I think I saw General Suresh there, Ashwini, then I'll come this way. Is that okay? Mics, wahan pe de dena please, first mic. And we'll request Professor Palat to respond there.
Thank you. I'm Suresh Bhattacharya. Absolutely, with great clarity and simplicity, you presented a very complex situation. Sir, my question is very fundamental. We expected that with the Russian advance, and we know about their blitzkrieg techniques, that Zelensky will roll up in a few days and go away. Now, with your presentation, it becomes clear that it's a fragmented society, which indicates more so that should have happened in a fragmented society. It hasn't happened. So where is the confidence with which President Zelensky and his team is conducting these operations? Thank you, sir.
Sir, I'm Colonel Ashwini Chanan from GK2. And my question, sir, is you mentioned financial sanctions briefly, but we probably couldn't cover it more. But yesterday I saw Karan Thappar's interview of the former RBI Governor Raghuram Rajan, and he's written an essay on the weaponization of the economic sanctions. And he spoke about that the way they're being rolled out now, it creates a precedence. And we are, since we have military men, we are aware of a word called collateral damage. But in terms of economic sanctions and the weaponization, the collateral damage is far wider and addresses probably those segments of the society. The middle class and the rich will be able to bear it, but the poor, and that is going to have a significant effect, number one. Number two, it creates a precedence for use of these sanctions beyond the Ukraine context. It will go probably across, and Professor Rajan said, for abortions, for human rights, probably the Western world would take it beyond this to other parts of the geography as well. So what are your thoughts on this? I know you probably based your lecture on the historical part of it, but this is now looking ahead, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, General. Yes, your guess that Zelensky should have submitted earlier, given that he is in such a fragmented society. But the point is that precisely because it's so fragmented, he's getting a lot of support from a certain type of rabid nationalism on the West, plus Poland, which plays a very important role, by the way, surprisingly. It is the one that is always egging him on. and he is being sustained by the European Union and in America, that we are here to back you up in one way or the other, so don't commit yourself. So that gives him the courage to do so. And he's getting the supplies of weaponry. I do not know how effective they are and so on. I mean, we are subject to a lot of disinformation, I know. Might be or might not be. But certainly a certain amount is coming from there. And that has enabled him to hold out in this way. So he sees the possibility of playing a heroic role here, almost a Churchillian role, with this kind of backing. And he is almost blackmailing the West, saying, it is now time for you to intervene, and why aren't you doing so? And the humanitarian crisis which he is constantly projecting, and which is being lapped up in the Western press, is designed to force the Western leaders to respond to that. A lot of it is coming out of him. So if a hospital is bombed and one person dies, they say, something close to war crime, genocide, etc. The hospital is empty, but nonetheless, it's made out that it is some colossal humanitarian crisis has occurred. Of course, always there is the 3.5 million to 4 million refugees now, but that is how he is presented. So he has been strengthened in this way, and he really has nowhere else to go. He's taken such an extreme position. If he now makes any sort of a commitment to the Russian side, he loses out totally, and he'll be so disgraced. Perhaps he has no future. You may remember, he might even be wanting to die heroically. Remember, he said, "This might be the last time you'll see me." That was his first broadcast. It would be a wonderful death. He would be a hero, and an ideal end to a impasse. He cannot get out of it. That might be why. Yeah, so now for your... weaponizing economic sanctions. You're very right. That's very likely to happen. Weapons at one time, sanctions at one time we assumed for these kinds of, for part of warfare. But if it goes to this extent and the masses are to be affected, it's the same as bombing of civilian areas. I mean, indiscriminate bombing we denounce as war crimes, but these we do not. But the same civilians are hit, the most helpless ones who cannot do anything at all. And that is not part of war crime, but nonetheless, it will now, I think, will be used. And in different ways, it is being used. Human rights is always being sanctioned by America in one way or the other. And they can choose these. So the precedent has been set, and I'm not sure that this will be necessarily such a big stimulant to that, because when they want it, they can use it. They have done it before. But it doesn't necessarily encourage it further, I think.
Well, even without the mic. Oh, well, thank you. I just wanted to know from you what you think might be the war aim of Putin and Russia. Would it be a kind of semi-Bangladesh kind of model, Bangladesh war kind of model, in which you decide to liberate certain areas which are seen as being independent and then declare victory and stop? Or is there a Sino-Indian kind of war kind of model in which you enter and then you go back and sort of teach a lesson or think you have taught a lesson? Or is it something else? This is, it doesn't seem clear, because from the Western media one gathers the way it's put across that, Russia simply wants to take over the whole of Ukraine. On the other hand, there was a statement of the Turkish foreign minister in the context of the talks between Ukraine and Russia that they were close to agreement. So perhaps you could elaborate on.
Nehru, just behind you, sir.
Good evening, sir. My question was, if we can measure the impact of dignifying regional histories to portray it as a set of cherry-picked events maybe, or the impact it might have on identity and the perception of a national character in this current situation that we face. Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Anil. About the war aims, it's a bit of a mystery. It has not been declared clearly, or rather, he has said no NATO, and he has even said, well, practically said this Zelensky must go. But there's no idea of taking over the whole of Ukraine. That would be a disaster for him, because that will turn the whole of Ukraine against him. As it is an invasion of Ukraine, however well disposed eastern Ukraine might be towards Russia, he's losing that support because it is an invasion. Warfare doesn't bring support that way necessarily, unless it is quick and finished like in Bangladesh. Certainly not when it takes so long and there is so many civilian casualties. And the war is not popular in Russia either. Putin is not certain of the domestic support he has, which is one reason he is accusing the Americans of trying to create a domestic constituency. Russians are certainly exasperated with Ukrainians and Ukrainian nationalism and politics, but they do not want to see a war there, because there's such intimate connections between Russia and Ukraine. This is very important to bear in mind. It is like England and Scotland. They do not wish to see invasion and destruction on the scale. So his war aim would be to make it impossible for Ukraine or for NATO or anybody to think in terms of a NATO implant there. That would be the main purpose. And if that is achieved, then that is enough. So it'll be perhaps more like the Chinese model. It'll come in and go out and saying, I've taught you a lesson, now do not repeat it. But the point is, he will do great damage to Ukraine in the course of it. Ukraine will suffer very badly. It's a price he's prepared to pay. He says, whatever happens, you will have to suffer this damage if you try this. You people get your act together. Don't think that being pro-Western means being anti-Russian in this fashion. And all the extravagances of Galician, Volhynian nationalism should not be carried over to the whole of Ukrainian policy in this fashion. So I think that would be the objective. He'd be very unwise to try to take over the whole of Ukraine. He doesn't want to, I think, either. As for the question about regional histories and does it legitimize or am I picking on particular histories to make a point?
No, I think the question really is that regional histories and their interpretation, meaning that narrative, does it become an important determinant in stoking this kind of nationalism? Please correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I got from your question.
Well,
regional history, their interpretation, so the power of narrative and how that in turn perhaps is impacting.
Well, that was a burden of my talk, in a sense. It was the regional divergences that are leading to this condition of Ukraine. It is not what is leading to actually Putin's decision to enter, but the condition of Ukraine which allows these external forces to play such a powerful role within Ukraine is due to this kind of regional differences. It is not just NATO and Putin at war just now, but earlier, as I explained about the Euromaidan crisis and the Orange Revolution crisis, it is a series of foreigners who are deciding who the Prime Minister and President should be, repeatedly. Now that is an extraordinary situation of its own. And at every point it is the European Union which is instructing the Election Commission, the Supreme Court, the bureaucracy and so on, how they should function and what standards they should attain, and giving them marks as if they are in school about how to qualify for entry into the European Union and so on. That is due to an internal regionalization of Ukraine, which they haven't been able to resolve yet. That's certainly the case.
I'll have to read this from here because this is the one that's wired. We have a question from one of our cyber participants. Mr. Suraj Kumar, if you can hear me. The question is for Professor Madhavan. Is there a humanitarian crisis in the Ukraine? Professor Madhavan, please take a clear stance. It's a very interesting kind of firm request to the learned professor. I'll recognize maybe one or two people. I'll definitely will to keep the 8 p.m. And Ravi, you're coming in last, but I'll try and get both you gentlemen in. Okay, I'll get some of you also. Is there a humanitarian?
Yes, there is a humanitarian crisis, certainly, quite obviously. If you have 3.5 to 4 million refugees already, who have to flee from Ukraine into Europe, or at least to Lvov and so on. They're displaced, but outside the Ukraine there are already 3.5 to 4 million. Within the Ukraine there are many more who are displaced. It is an obvious crisis. I mean, nobody need to underestimate that. My point was not to say that there is no crisis. My point is that every war is a humanitarian crisis. I do not want to pretend that there's some nice, sweet wars where you have it all good. That only happens in children's books. But all wars are of this kind, and modern wars particularly are necessarily so. Civilians are almost combatants in a way that they were not until the middle of the 19th century. They are the first targets. In fact, it is safer to be a soldier than a civilian, I think, in many wars in modern times. At least as a soldier, you're armed and you know how to fight. As a civilian, you have no such capacities. And you are a sitting duck all the time. So, yes, it is a very major crisis, and without a doubt. And nobody is underestimating that, I'm sure. And I hope I've taken a clear enough stand on that, despite skepticism.
I think very clear, but just for Mr. Suraj Kumar, and I may say this from here if I may. I think it's a very important point that Madhavan has made. Mr. Kumar, you introduced a very important dimension about the humanitarian crisis. I'll just make one statement, because this is a very important subject, needs a whole session and more. That technology, if you look at it from both the world wars, has actually rendered the citizen vulnerable. For instance, the aerial bombing and so on. But as I said, this is a very important subject. This is not the first humanitarian crisis. It has just received much greater attention. But let me leave it at that. This is not a value judgment. This is just a very, I would say, sad admission of technology and politics and the vulnerability of the citizen. But on that note, what I will do is I'll recognize you two gentlemen, and at the back, and if you all could just make your, ma'am, Joe. Okay, please, Liana, can you just speak? Yeah, mic is coming to you. I'll get you on board, Joe.
Sir, I'm Captain D.K. Singh from Indian Navy. Sir, during your talk, you said that post this conflict, Russia will take a major hit. Just one point, sir. The dependency of European Union for gas to Russia, and as the winter approaches, it will further go up. China might go to Russia. The Russian foreign minister is visiting India for the gas. So maybe after 5-6 months, after the war gets over, Russia may be able to bounce back because of the world energy need. What is your point, sir, on this? If Russia is going to bounce back, will there be a new circuit of Russia, Iran, China, and India?
Thank you for that very wide-ranging lecture. So while you were speaking, I was thinking. Sure, I'm Tarun Saint. So just to go back to some of the points you were making, I was somehow reminded of the context of the Cold War and the accentuated sense of mirror images that then prevailed, and that sense of the mirroring of the darkest side of the other, which of course is so well captured in some of the spy novels of John le Carre and others. But here there's that heating up, of course, of the Cold War into an actual war, a flashpoint which has led to the invasion. And the science fiction writer Vladimir Sorokin has written about Putin in a particular light in this context as sort of somehow regressing back to a kind of imperial, autocratic, almost czarist era model. And he also seems to think that Putin has a particular kind of agenda, which is to destroy Western civilization. Now, of course, one can't say whether that's actually verifiable, but psychologically speaking, is there a kind of tendency towards that sort of regression into the darker side of the heart, which is not just exclusively Russian in its orientation, but which war can sort of give free play to, as it were, a kind of narcissism which is projected outwards, externalized. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Jyoti Malhotra, and as a card-carrying member of the Madhavan Palat fan club, I'd just like to say thank you so much for your brilliant presentation. My question is, if there is a humanitarian crisis, which of course there is, 3.5-4 million people, refugees, if, as you say, the Russian population is divided over the war with Ukraine, and if Putin's goals aren't as clear, then would you say that the Russian president has sort of walked into a trap, perhaps of his own making? I mean, he needn't have bombed Ukraine into submission to be able to denazify it or to avert sort of NATO missiles or other armaments on Russia's door. Thank you.
Request the esteemed Professor Madhavan to give us Twitter replies in very short characters, but as I said, to the extent that you can, and we will then have him here a few minutes after the formal closure. But Madhavan, all yours.
Contradictory terms. You said you said professor. Professors never speak for less than 1 hour at a time. Yeah. Yeah. Will Russia be able to bounce back? Not in a hurry. It's going to be quite a tough call, because of course it has energy supplies to be provided to Europe, and Europe will compromise on the matter, I think, because of that. And therefore Russia has a negotiating space available. It will not be as die-hard as it is now. But bouncing back will be a bigger job, because the resources on the other side are so much greater to punish Russia than for Russia to be able to punish them. So Russia will be back into a trap of the kind of a closed space like it was in the Soviet Union. Though that world is partially coming back, perhaps, rather than Russia being able to bounce back and being able to deal equally with everybody, with the rest of the world, I think. Tarun Sen's question about the context of the Cold War and the mirror images. The Cold War was the best example of the mirror images. Yes, that's very true, because the two sides are so well balanced. Well, not really so balanced. Soviet Union was much weaker still, but ostensibly very well balanced, and they had resources enough to pit against each other's way. We do not find that occurring now. Russia is very isolated, actually. I mean, all this China being friendly is a very limited operation. China will not choose Russia over US. Why should it? China is just striking a good bargain with both the US and Russia in such a situation. Anybody would choose US if you can get it. The whole point is to get it. And therefore, this is the right time to strike the bargain. So Russia is terribly, terribly isolated. At least during the Cold War, it wasn't. It had a whole series of supporters around the world, not the least all the communist parties outside the Soviet bloc. They were a major support base. All that's gone now. So Russia has a sort of residual sympathy, and there are a whole lot of people around the world who say, well, this is not our war, and therefore we are not joining in. And by neutrality becomes a form of support for Russia. In the whole of Ukraine, that's how it's interpreted also. Are you pro-Western or are you neutral? Neutral means pro-Russian. So in that sense, Russia has a certain worldwide support. But otherwise, Russia is very isolated, and that support is not going to be translated into real action of any kind. Jyoti's point, if Russia is internally divided, has Russia walked into a trap? It's not a trap. For Russia, it's a choice between either the submitting to NATO now or trying to hold it off and see how much you can negotiate and how long you can keep NATO off. So, and the Americans are constantly giving them that choice. We are coming, we are coming, we are coming. And what are you going to do? So finally Putin took his stand and said, let us see how far you can go. So it's not a trap, but it is a denouement he was expecting for a long time. And in fact, Russians have been expecting since the 1990s with the positions of NATO. It is structured this way. They all know it's going to happen. It's like a Greek tragedy. We all know it's going to happen. What do you do about it? How far can you go? And what negotiating space do you have? That is what he's trying to find out. So he's not been caught, but he's doing the best that he can.
Thank you, Madhavan. It's just, I'm in a bit of a dilemma because I promised some people who asked me over coffee that we'll stop sharp at 8. What I can do is that, if it's okay by our speaker and you, maybe we could spend some time informally when we close the session, sir. I hope you don't mind. I have two people from cyber, and I'm going to apologize to them also, Mr. Dilip Simeon from New Delhi and Mr. Vinod Kumar from Kochi. I'm sorry, sirs, I can't take your questions because of the lack of time. We promised we'd close by 8, and I know some of you have to catch up with other appointments. The question here from Dilip Simeon, and not to be answered, Professor Palat, did Ukraine, along with Belarus and the Russian Federation, have separate seats in the UN General Assembly? Yes. Yes is a short answer. I'm sorry, I don't want to make this into a quiz. Sorry, Dilip. And the second is, what bearing did the Russian suppression of Chechnya have on the geopolitics of the current situation? There are more questions. I'm not going to read them, and I'm really apologize for this. Over the last 2 years of COVID, sirs at the back, you there, sir, my apologies, but Madhavan will be here. You can speak to him separately, one-on-one. 2 years of COVID, we were all been attending some webinars, conferences, and so on. And there was one very interesting innovation, where I had participated in one of these pan-India events. And when we had finished, and the lead speaker, the host who was not in the same location, said that we have a tradition of presenting a shawl to the esteemed chief guest or the speaker. Those of you who are familiar with South India would recognize this. Many shawls are presented to the lead speaker or the chief guest at the end of an event. That was not possible because of the COVID protocols. So they had introduced what they called as a shawl of appreciation that was conveyed by an oral manner. So today I'm taking the liberty of inviting Mr. Ravi Bhutalingam, who's sitting here. I've just shanghaied him, Ravi, if I may say so, who's also been a speaker in our series. And interestingly, I just got to know about this when we were having a cup of coffee or tea, that Ravi and Madhavan were in school together, the St. Columbus Mafia, and then went onwards to Delhi University, Stephens, and then onwards to UK, to London, Oxford, Cambridge, and then went separate paths. So Ravi, can I, put this on you? You can speak from there if you want, if you don't want to disturb the others. Saab ko mic wahi de dena. Is that okay? So that, you are. The only thing is that if you speak from here, the cyber world will hear you. So you want to come here maybe. Whatever you say. If you can move on your right, it will be easier, I think, as opposed to the ladies on this side. Sorry, folks, for being so. Bye-bye. We understand. I know you had to leave at 8 o'clock. Just give us a few more minutes and we'll wrap up. Hey, Saab yahi aayenge, because I think it will be easier. I should have thought of this and made Ravi sit at the end, but I hadn't planned that far. Please. This is the virtual shawl. Ravi?
Is there something physical you're going to give me?
No, we
okay.
haven't planned it.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, after that absolutely magnificent presentation, I'm not going to stand in your way. I have no qualification at all in geopolitics or history or anything resembling the field that Madhavan has covered. I think it's only my long association with him. And what I have discovered during that association, which is that he has, as you would have noticed, two absolutely essential qualities which are very, very rare and make occasions like this very worthwhile. One is a very deep knowledge of whatever he's talking about. And I've seen this time and again because I've attended a large number of his talks. And the second is the power of language and communication. So he is able to communicate that knowledge to an audience, whether physical or now cyber. Each one of these qualities would have been very unusual if it had just been alone. But when you combine those, you get a very remarkable effect. And thank you very much for that, Madhavan, for this evening. So, having said this, let me drape the shawl. At least I'll do it symbolically. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you very much. Very nice. Okay, it just remains for me to thank all of you formally for being here. Just to add to what Ravi said, maybe one more quality for Madhavan is that he wears his learning lightly. And I think that's also very rare. And today's lecture has been absolutely, I think, impressive in terms of its scope and its lucidity. And hopefully, and I don't want to make this sound like a threat, but Professor Palat has promised to share his notes at an appropriate time. That will be circulated. But thank you very much, everyone. I know you all need to go. I just want to thank you all and leave a last note as encouraging those of you who are here that we will be doing this again under the Habitat SPS banner, and we hope that you will be able to join us. I do want to encourage our younger members this evening who are here that if you would like to write about this subject, his talk, why I don't agree with Madhavan Palat, would be a great way of writing 800, 900 words. We'll hoist it in one of our websites, but otherwise we'll keep you informed. Leave your cards if you want to be on our mailing list over here, and we'll make sure you come. I want to thank all of you personally, especially for your cell phone discipline. Doesn't happen all the time, but not a phone rang. And our entire team, apart from thanking our speaker formally, thanking the Habitat, Mr. Suneet Tandon, the director who's here, the SPS, Tarun has just left, and the entire team, the cyber team that's worked quietly, silently. I know I can name Shadab, George, Sushil, Anandita, Shreya in different parts of India for allowing us and enabling us to conduct this in the seamless manner that we have. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good night, and we'll catch up. Those of you who had questions, please come up. He'll also sign autographs this evening, I think. Thank you.